Hey guys, it's Lisa and welcome to my channel. Today's video is going to be a compilation of many of my favorite fall DIY projects. The majority of these will be ones that I've done in the past, but then I've also added some in. For DIY number one, all you're going to need is a book and something to use for a stem, because we're going to turn this book into a pumpkin. And I'm sure you guys have seen these made. We're going to do a few extra touches on it to make it more unique and give it a better look. Now, I'm using a paperback. You could use a hardback if you wanted. And I'm making this one small, and I've made many of these with larger books. But you're just going to somewhat draw out the half shape of a pumpkin. Now, as long as you get this round in some way, it's going to resemble a pumpkin, because that's just the beauty of pumpkins, is they're very, very uneven and unique and very forgiving. So what I'm doing is just taking a few pages at a time. I think I do maybe about 5, which I know is more than a few. And I'm just going to cut each one of them. I'm going to trace onto the next one and then just keep cutting. Now, you could use scissors for this, or you could use an X-Acto knife to keep going around, which is what I'm going to do. I just cut those first pages, and now I'm just very firmly cutting in as far as my X-Acto knife would go. You can also use a regular utility knife for this. If you're really brave, you can, and you have a jigsaw, you could hold this very tightly together as you cut that out, but that's going to take some extra hands, or at least a clamp or two to hold it in place. So rather than do all that, and I have a hard time videotaping sawing anyway, because I'm just not set up for that yet. So I'm just going to keep cutting until this is torn away. Now, this is something that if you have a problem with your hands, this is a lot of continuous cutting and pressure, and it's just really not fun on your hands, and I wouldn't attempt it right now. This was a past video that I did, but you just keep cutting till you cut them off. Now, I have cut these before with the saw, so it is doable. Now so for most people, when they make these pumpkins, they just cut it out and then they glue the front and back pages together and just kind of fluff them up and make a pumpkin. I'm going to take some additional steps on this, and this is one of them. I'm just kind of wadding each individual page up. And this takes a little bit, but it really does make a difference in how your pumpkin lays. Now, for this last page, you want to glue down that spine and fold it together. Now, because the spine is somewhat stiff, I am taking my scissors. You could take a knife or even a utility knife and slice down through that, just to weaken that, so that you can roll it around and glue it together. So then you want to do that with hot glue, obviously, and then you want to hold it together until you make sure that it has that it's going to stay well. And then you just keep going through and wadding up the pages even more. And I kind of pulled that center apart because I didn't give it long enough. So I re-glued that, but you'll just keep adding, and if you need to glue back a little bit in the pages, you don't want to glue on the outside, but if you want to glue here and there on the inside of the pages, near the spine, then you can do that also. But also, if something needs to be trimmed, just take your scissors and trim it. And in order to keep this open, I'm just cutting a piece of cardboard, and I'm going to glue this on as the base. And that will keep your pages open where you want them. So I just put a bunch of hot glue on that cardboard and then glued it to the bottom of the pumpkin. Now I need a stem, so I'm just taking a stick that I found in the yard, and I'm going to glue. I have that hole there, so I'm just going to stick it down in that hole and glue it with some hot glue. And now another step that I'm going to take with this that I haven't seen done is I like to mix a little bit of brown paint in a spray bottle of water and mist it over the pages. That will do two things. It will age the pages even more, and if you start with an old book, you don't have to worry about that. In that case, you can just spray it with water. But I wanted to add a little bit more color, so I added that paint. You can also put some very strong coffee in a spray bottle and spray that on it. That works also. And it's probably a better option because then you don't have to worry about getting your paint too thick and stopping up your spray bottle. I'm sorry about any background noise that you may hear. I have my dryer going. Now, once I got my embellishments glued on, I just mixed up some brown paint in some water and started spraying it until I was happy with the results. Now, you can get this almost as wet as you want. You would probably avoid getting it soaked on the inside where you've used all the hot glue, but the outside can take whatever you want to add to it, and then I just set it in the sun to dry. And now I'm making a hang tag, and all that I'm doing is stamping the word fall on it and aging around the outside. And although this one is a little time consuming, it is very simple to do and takes very, very little material. And these display really well on top of a candlestick or in sets with different sizes of these. But these are just a really pretty neutral decor. They don't even have to be completely neutral because the water that you mix with the paint can be mixed with an orange paint, and you can add color to them or some other color. DIY number 2 is a very simple one, and you just start with a vase that is the shape of a pumpkin. Now that might be harder to do. I think the hardest part of this one is finding the right vase. This one just happened to be given to me, and when I looked at it and started to try to work it into the decor, I saw a pumpkin. So I'm going to give this a coat of gray. You could use this brown as your base coat. The only problem with it is you're painting onto slick glass. And if I were going to paint this to use as a vase, I would definitely use some slick stick first to make sure that it sticks well. But because this is going to be some faux painting, and I'm okay if it's not perfect, I didn't worry with that step. Now, while this is still wet, I'm working some other colors into it. Right now, I'm working some white paint into it. I think this was buttercream that I used here. And I'm just kind of working it here and there, but making sure that I keep a lot of that gray intact. Because what's going to help this look more like a pumpkin is to have those warmer undertones. And so I'm just kind of brushing it over and letting some of that gray blend into my white. That's just going to add even more dimension in your color. And I decided at this point that I wanted to add some texture. So I mixed my paint, and so I used equal parts of paint and baking soda because I wanted this to have a lot of texture. So you'll want quite a bit of texture for this one. And I think I did about half and half, which is about the maximum that you can do because it starts to get too thick to work with. But I did want as much of the texture as I could work with. And then I just start kind of working this on. Now still, even though I'm losing some of that undercolor, I'm making sure to leave plenty of it to give this pumpkin more dimension. Because if you had just done the dimension in the color or the thickness of the paint and texture, the texture wouldn't have showed up as well if you didn't leave some undertones. Now you have the option also, if you get too much of your light color on, you can add some of the dark back in, just kind of in a dry brush effect. But for me, I didn't have to on this one. I got enough texture and left enough of the undertones that I was happy with the way it looked. And then once I allowed that to dry, then I embellished the top with a little bit of Spanish moss and put a stick down in it and glued that in place. And then I added some faux twigs and greenery around the top and a hang tag, and this one was finished. DIY number 3 is a very simple one as well. And what I'm doing is just taking a book. This book could be the right color, but I want this to be more of a muted orange, so I am turning this into a pumpkin. And again, this is very, very simple. You just paint your book the color that you want it, and I'm kind of mingling some other colors down into it as well. And this will be kind of like the scrap wood pumpkins. And to make sure that it stays closed, because obviously you're going to need it to stay closed, then I just take a little strip of fabric and glue it to the inside of the back cover and the inside of the front cover, and just kind of pull that closed and make sure that it's good and tight, and that will help keep your book together. And then of course you're going to need a stem of some sort, so you could either glue something to the top of this and then add some leaves like I'm going to do here, or on another book, I just used a butter knife and just kind of stuck it down into the top, and that works well also. You also have the option of decoupaging over the top of your paint to give it a different look. This is just a napkin, one layer of a napkin, and I'm just using the printed layer of a napkin and gluing it to both the front and back cover, and then I'll make this pumpkin the same way that I did the first. And with this one, I did the same process. I decoupaged a napkin on this one, and instead of gluing my stem to the top of the book, I glued it to the spine, and that just gives it a little different look. DIY number 4 is a wreath made from old book pages. So you start out by tearing several pages from an old book. Now, an old book is good for this, but if you get one that's too old, then the pages are too crisp. So there's a fine line there. And I'm folding this one corner down to the side and then cutting that as a square. And then I'm going to fold both of two opposite corners in together, overlapping them. And then I'll just make several of these. I don't know how many I used here, but as you can see, it's pretty simple, so it doesn't take that long to do. And then you're just going to kind of pinch them together in the center as you add them to your wire wreath form. So you're going to need a book and a wire wreath form for this one. And then you're just going to keep up that process until you cover the entire wreath form. And then when you get your entire wreath form finished or covered, you're essentially finished with your wreath. But I just made a scrappy bow and added that to embellish it. DIY number 5 is a pumpkin project where I'm just taking the Dollar Tree pumpkins, and I've painted this one so that the orange doesn't show through anywhere. But all I'm doing with this is I've taken an old book and I've cut strips of that old book, and I want to cut along with the words. That way when I glue this on, you'll be able to see individual words rather than words that are cut apart, if that makes sense. So this one takes a little bit, but again, it's a very simple one that I feel like has a really good look to it. Now, if you were to cover this, you could tear your book up and just cover it in pieces. But I like these little thin strips of wording, and that's how I cut it out, was I would cut each line out. Now, you can make it a little bit easier and cut 2 lines out at a time, but you're just going to cover the whole thing, and then you'll finish it off the same way you do any other one that you cover. And for this one, though, because you're not covering it with fabric, you'll need to fill in that hole in the top some instead of just gluing your stem on. So what I did was put some Spanish moss down in it and glued that in place with some hot glue, and then added my stem and leaves after that. But again, this is a little bit time consuming. But this one, I have no idea what I asked for it. I think about $8, but it sold right away. So this is just gives you a good neutral look, and if you're decorating in neutral colors, this is just really pretty to add into your decor, and it actually goes really well with the book pumpkin that we made in one of the earlier projects. Now, I prepared some of these pumpkins ahead of time and wasn't sure exactly what I was doing with each one of them, and if I had prepared it for this only, I would have been very, very careful when I took that stem off to only leave the hole from the stem, and then I wouldn't have had to add anything to the top when I added my stem. But isn't that pretty? I think it makes such a neat little pumpkin, and you can see here what I'm talking about by tearing each line out, because then you see all that wording. And I forgot what I did here was just glue this to the bottom of the inside, and then I glued my Spanish moss around the outside. Again, if I had kept in mind what I was using the pumpkin for when I prepared it, then I wouldn't have had to do all this. But I do think that adding the Spanish moss around the top really added to this. So if I were to do it the other way, I would still add the Spanish moss. DIY number 6 was a really fun project to do. So I took some of these little pie pans, the little disposable pie pans, and made some faux pies. Now I painted the outside of the pie pans with some brown paint, and then while they were still wet, sprinkled some cinnamon on them just to give them more of a rusty old look. But then I took some of the fabric Warm and Natural, and that's just a quilt batting, and I dipped it in some strong coffee and then let it dry. And that's what I'm going to use for my pie crust, and that makes a really neat pie crust. It actually looks pretty realistic when you're finished with it. And I just used the outside of the pie plate as my template. And then I cut about a little more than a 1/2-inch strip, the length, to cover the outside of the pie plate, plus giving myself quite a bit of extra because I'm going to pleat that around the outside. And you'll see what I'm talking about when I put this together. But I think this is probably close to a 1/2-inch strip. And then to assemble this together, it's a very, very simple process. So I just filled it with some polyfill and then covered it with the circle. But before I hot glued the circle to my pie plate, I cut a couple of slits or a few slits in the top, and that just kind of mimics the holes that you get when that you cut, so that it releases the pressure. So I just made sure to secure that very carefully around the edges and get the whole pie plate covered. I didn't add any paint to the top of the pie plate so that I would make sure and it would make sure and hold better. And then after it was secured on good, then I started to add some little foam blueberries. And these I ordered from Amazon, and these were done quite a while back, but I will try to find these and link them in the description. But you could also make some from clay or even Play-Doh or something like that. These all you need is just that, just the illusion of blueberries down in your pie, or you could use any kind of fruit down inside. But I just glued a couple or a few maybe in each hole, just so that it would kind of look like those blueberries were kind of bursting out of the pie. And then I just started gluing that strip around the edges, pleating it as I went. So you just kind of glue a little spot, pinch that into a pleat, and glue that down, and then just keep that process all the way around. And I went back, after I did this process, I went back and glued underneath some of those pleats to make sure that they stayed in place good also. I think this makes a very realistic looking pumpkin, and you could leave it like this, or you could brush it with a little Mod Podge and maybe sprinkle a little cinnamon over the top of it, or even if you like that look, you could add a little bit of iridescent glitter. But I chose to add cinnamon on this one because I just like the primitive look that it gives it. And I just concentrated more of that glue around the edges, and I'm using Mod Podge here. You could use regular school glue, but I just concentrated more of it around the edges to make it look more like the pie crust had browned more around the edges. And then I just sprinkled some on, and I decided to add a few of the blueberries to the center, so I just hot glued a few of the blueberries to the center just to add it another little touch. I also made some full-size pies this way, and so I just cut my pie crust or my Warm and Natural, the size for the larger pie crust. And on this one, I wanted to make this one a cherry one. So what I did was, before I glued my circle on for the pie crust, I just took some little scraps of a red fabric, and I just used red gingham here. And this doesn't have to be perfect, you just want it to show through. And I could have even just used small enough strips to go underneath each of those pleats. And in hindsight, that probably would have been better if I had just cut some little pieces of this fabric and glued them on the back side of the Warm and Natural, just underneath each of those holes. That would have saved me quite a bit of fabric, and it would have been a lot easier also. So when you make yours, if you decide to make some, to me that's your better option. And if I make any more of these, that's exactly what I'll do. I was just kind of figuring it out as I went, and again, if I had it to do over, that would be a simpler way. So then I just glued my Warm and Natural over the top of this, the same way I did with the smaller one. And in the same way I glued and pleated the strip around the edges, I did also with this one. And for this one, to age around the edges of this one, I decided to use my distress ink. So I just used my little foam brush and some distress ink and added more color around the edges, again, to make it look like my pie crust was browned. This particular Warm and Natural didn't coffee stain as dark as the other anyway. So, but this is a good option instead of having, if you're in a hurry and you don't want to wait on your Warm and Natural to dry before you do your project, you could just go ahead and do it with undyed Warm and Natural and then add your color in this way. And I didn't purchase these berries from Amazon. These are some that I pulled from an old pick, so it was just holly berries or something like that. And I just kind of stuffed those down in there. Again, you just want the illusion of the cherries coming through. Another touch that I thought of when I got to this one was to mix some red food coloring in some Elmer's school glue. So I just took my bottle and added some food coloring in it until I got the color that I wanted. And then I just kind of dripped that into that hole and let it come out the top a little bit around the hole. And that gave it a lot more realistic look. I could have also done that with the blueberries. And so any pie that you're doing, if you were doing an apple pie, you might add a little bit of brown to some glue and let that kind of seep out. Another touch I added was letting a little bit of that seep out of the outside as well. And then I added some to the center, and I just kind of squeezed a little pile of it in the center so that I could drop some of those berries on it. And I decided with this one I wanted the appearance of sugar on top. So I just brushed some Mod Podge all over the top. And again, you could just use regular school glue here. But then I sprinkled it with some kosher salt. And I wanted to show you what the pan looks like after I've painted it and sprinkled it with cinnamon. For this one, I cut some pieces of this same fabric and into little wedges and stuffed those down inside to make it look like apples. And then here I'm adding the glue that I've added a little bit of paint to and letting that kind of ooze out those holes. And this one I brushed with some glue and sprinkled some cinnamon over the top. And I even made some little faux fried pies by cutting a circle and filling it and gluing it together, and then adding that little crimped edge around it. And those were very, very simple to do. And there they are in the basket, and I think they turned out really neat. DIY number 7 is a very simple fall bowl filler. I don't think you can get much simpler than this one. I just made myself a cardboard template, and the size is totally up to you. For me, it was a little bit larger than my hand, and I cut out 2 of these triangles, and you can use whatever fabric you want. The Warm and Natural would work fine for this. I'm using drop cloth here. You could use drop cloth or muslin, but I just cut my fabric a little bit larger than my template. And I'm just doing this to allow for a seam allowance. Now this could be this could be sewed together with a sewing machine, or it could be sewed by hand. This is such a small little project that if you don't have a sewing machine, or if you're like I was for years and just didn't want to use it for fear of tearing it up, then you could definitely just hand sew this one. I guess you could even use hot glue and glue it together. But I hand stitched mine and left the bottom open so that I could stuff it with some polyfill. Now you could turn this so that your seam was on the inside if that's the look that you want, but I'm going for a more primitive look, so I left my seam on the outside, and then I'm going to purposely fray those edges anyway. So I just stuffed it as much as I felt like it needed for the look that I wanted, and then I sewed that bottom together as well. And once I had the bottom sewed together, then it was ready for paint. So I just mixed some colors here until I got a warmer yellow color that I felt like was the right color for the candy corn. And then I'm using the color terracotta for the bottom for the orange that's on the candy corn. And because I started with an off-white color of fabric, I didn't have to paint the inside part. But I did paint these colors on both sides. And then once they dried well, then I took my little finger sander and really, really sanded on those edges to give it more of a frayed look. Now this is why I didn't want to turn my seam to the inside, but I just really, really roughed up those edges. And then I took some distress ink and distressed heavily around the edges and a little on the inside of the candy corn as well. And then I took a little torn strip of fabric, and I think this was some coffee stained tea towel, and some jute twine, and tied around the center. Now you could add a hang tag at this point, but I just tied that little string around. I think what would be really neat is to add a little tag that says sweets or something like that, maybe even candy corn. But I added a little rusty safety pin instead. DIY number 8 is another very simple bowl filler, and I just took a couple of pieces of a scrap fabric, and this is just kind of a fall color that I wanted to use, and made a template in a rectangle shape with the corners rounded, and just sewed right sides together on this. Actually, I didn't sew right sides together. On this one, I sewed it the same way that I did the other one and left that seam showing. So I just sewed 3 corners of this or 3 sides of this together and left room to stuff it and add a piece of driftwood for the stem, because as you can see, this is going to be a pumpkin. So right now I'm just placing that in there and pinning it off so that it will stay in the place that I want it. And then I glue underneath that fabric there to secure it onto the stem, and then I finish sewing the top together. I also used my little finger sander to fray the edges of this one, and then I cut a little square just a little smaller than my rectangle and stamped on it and glued it to the front. Now, I could have done this before I added my stuffing, and I could have actually done this before I even sewed my fabrics together. And then I could have sewed this on instead, and I think that would look good if you sewed it on and used a darker thread to leave your stitches showing. I think that would add another primitive touch that would be really cute. But for me, I just stamped on this, and any stamp that you like, that you think looks good for fall, and then glued it in place. And I'm using an IOD crockery stamp on mine. And then I used my distress ink to age this around the edges and some even on the inside of the fabric. And then I tied a little raffia grass bow around the top. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you in the next. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great evening, and God bless you and your family.